The bosun and the other 4 guys were never seen again, so we don't know what happened to them. I'd like to believe that they Donner partied, for sure. Sorry, I apparently really can't seem to get away from cannibalism. Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff. Disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. Now, if you've been listening to my show, you may have guessed by now that I'm a big fan of naval disasters. Well, that and cannibalism, apparently. I don't know why. Listen, I don't plan it. But it's 50-50 whether or not the stories I tell happen to have cannibalism in them. Sometimes I don't even know ahead of time. I promise, it just happens. But another thing I love is a good shipwreck story. It's probably because my husband was in the British Royal Navy, but I find ships, naval stories, and wrecks just immensely fascinating. I've already explained the mystery of the ghost ship Mary Celeste, which was found floating adrift, its crew just, gone. And I also taught you about the Lost Franklin expedition. The one where John Franklin led the HMS Terror and Erebus up into the Arctic, searching for the Northwest Passage, but the ship got stuck in sea ice and all of the men died in the frozen wastelands around King William Island. So today, we're going to explore more naval disasters, and I do mean disasters plural, because we're going to talk about 2 shipwrecks that occurred on the Auckland Islands in 1864. And the craziest part, these shipwrecks crashed on opposite sides of the Aucklands, and each had no idea that the other was there the entire time. One wreck tells the story of human ingenuity and what men will do to survive. The other shows what happens when men panic and don't work together. And though both ships wrecked on the Aucklands in the same year, their stories and experiences are vastly different. So today, I'm going to tell you the story of the Grafton and the Invercauld. How can 2 ships crash on the same island without knowing the other was there? Why were they there in the first place? And why did they have vastly different experiences? As usual, I'll dive into the historical context of the period to help explain why the Auckland Islands attracted these ships and why some men made it out alive while others perished. To have 2 ships wrecked on the same island at more or less the same time is a crazy coincidence. So let's break it down and get to the bottom of what happened with the Auckland Island shipwrecks. Now, the Auckland Islands are roughly 300 miles south of New Zealand. It's made up of 2 main islands, Adams Island to the south, which is the smaller one, and Auckland Island to the north, the larger one. And there's also a small rock off the northwest coast called Disappointment Island, which is probably my favorite name ever. Disappointment Island. I love it. It's the best. And yes, there have been wrecks on Disappointment Island as well, which is really fitting considering the name. So interestingly, the Auckland Islands have a bit of a history prior to the shipwrecks, and we'll talk about that briefly today, in addition to many other shipwrecks that happened after our story as well. Side note, there were so many wrecks here that people eventually put caches and chests full of survival supplies that they would refill periodically for any castaways stuck on the island. But anyway, the Auckland Islands are pretty remote. Even famed British explorer Captain James Cook, in his several voyages of discovery across the South Pacific in the 18th century, that's the 1700s, never found them. Though, to be fair, Cook didn't sail too far into the waters south of New Zealand anyway. The Aucklands were first discovered, by Europeans at least, in 1806 by Abraham Bristow, a whaler who sailed there on the whale ship Ocean looking for, you guessed it, whales. But just to be fair, the Maori peoples of the South Pacific had most likely popped by the Aucklands way before the Europeans anyway. Later, the also famous British explorer James Clark Ross sailed to the Aucklands on November 20th, 1840. Does his name sound familiar, James Clark Ross? Well, it should, if you're a fan of the AF-Out podcast, or of British naval history, or maybe the Terror miniseries on AMC. Because James Clark Ross was one of the earlier explorers to the Arctic, looking for the Northwest Passage through Baffin Bay. You know, the venture that ended up claiming the lives of Sir John Franklin and his men on board the HMS Terror and Erebus. But you know what's even more super neat and coincidental about that? James Clark Ross sailed to the Aucklands on the Terror and Erebus. Yeah, the same two ships. 5 years before the ships went missing and sank off the Arctic coast of King William Island, they were sailing the South Pacific with James Clark Ross on one of his many adventures. And I swear, I don't plan these things at all. It's just a crazy coincidence. But anyway, Ross's stop at the Aucklands was part of his super famous journey to Antarctica from 1839 to 1843. And while on the Aucklands, Ross released pigs, rabbits, and hens on the island. This was a pretty common practice for sailors to do in the early days, right? The idea was to get a natural population of animals going, and once they reproduce enough, there should be an abundant food supply for future expeditions. And hey, listen, by the way, this is a really super bad thing for the environment. We know a lot more now about things like invasive species, so we should never do this intentionally. It is not a good idea to release a foreign plant or animal in a new environment, as, again, you're going to end up with a horrible invasive species problem because they don't have any natural predators and they take over and they can kill trees and plants, and it's bad. Don't do it. Like right now in New Jersey, where I currently live and I'm recording this podcast, it's about the season for spotted lanternflies to start coming back, and those things are a horribly invasive species that suck the literal life out of trees. So that sucks. If you ever see them, kill them, look them up. The government tells us to, like, straight up squish them. Anyway, in addition to the animals, Ross planted gooseberries, raspberries, strawberries, turnips, cabbages, and currants. To be honest, it sounds like a hobbit's dream. But he didn't stay long, and from there he set south for Antarctica. So by this point, with Ross's quick trip there, news of the Auckland Islands is spreading, and a whaler named Charles Enderby decides to set up a settlement there. He arrives at the tail end of 1849, the beginning of 1850, and accompanying him are 150 men, women, and children. Together, they build a settlement called Hardwick. Now, I won't get too into Hardwick here because it's not the point of our story today, but just know that the settlement was a disaster and was abandoned 3 years later. The soil, you see, was touted as being like rich and fertile, but in reality it was acidic and just awful, really. Couldn't grow anything. And in addition to the garbage soil, the Aucklands have bad weather. I mean, consider that they're located 50 degrees south of the equator, which in the middle of the ocean, it's a pretty rough climate. The Aucklands are almost constantly soaked with a barrage of wet winds and waves, and the only stable populations that can live there are seabirds, like albatrosses, as well as sea lions. Now, sea lions are a really interesting part of this story because they're known to inhabit the Aucklands as well as the whales, right? And in fact, it's the reason why one of our shipwrecked crews came here in the first place. The market for sea lions and seal fur was pretty good in the early to mid-19th century. Let's do a quick lesson, by the way, on the difference between a sea lion and a seal, because I think a lot of people wouldn't know the difference and might use the terms interchangeably. Seals, and in particular I'm talking about fur seals here, have longer, shaggy fur that is brown in color for both males and females. They have small ear holes with no external flaps or anything, no like visible external ears. Their nose is more pointy and they have cute little long whiskers. So if it's brown and fuzzy with cute long whiskers, it's probably a fur seal. Sea lions are closely related to fur seals, but they have different distinguishing characteristics. Unlike their seal cousins, sea lions are the ones with the ear flaps on the side of their head. They're also typically larger, but I guess without a side-by-side comparison, that's not really that helpful to know, I guess. Sea lions have broader, blunter noses, unlike the seals' pointy ones. The bulls, or the males, are brown, but the females are very different, and it helps you distinguish between them. Female sea lions have a more caramel-colored coat with stripy or spotted patterns on it. Sea lions are also the ones that use their hind flippers as little feet, sorta, where they can do something resembling walking. Seals can't do this. Seals have to scoot around on their bellies while they're on the land. And sea lions are the ones that bark at you. Alright, so pretty clear difference between the two. On the Aucklands, our crews will encounter sea lions. In addition to the whaling nearby, the sea lions were a good draw for explorers and ship crews looking to make some extra money, because the skins and the oils fetched a pretty good price. So now we're a bit more familiar with the Aucklands. They are remote islands visited by a handful of Europeans over the span of a few decades in the early 19th century, that's the 1800s. There's not much here for sustaining a settlement, as evidenced by Hardwick failing after 3 years, but there is abundant natural life. It's not necessarily life that can sustain humans, but life exists there regardless. The weather is rough, so prolonged settlement, again, probably not a good option, which is unfortunate, of course, because it's on these wild little islands that 2 ships, the Grafton and the Invercauld, wrecked in 1864, and its crews had to scrounge to survive on sea lions and whatever else they could get their hands on. So let's get into the first wreck. In November 1865, a schooner named the Grafton set sail from Sydney, Australia. On it was a crew of 5, captained by Thomas Musgrave. Musgrave, along with his friend Francois Raynal, decided to buy the Grafton and set sail for Campbell Island, which is even further south than the Aucklands. The idea was to mine for argentiferous tin, which means silver-bearing tin. Campbell Island was said to have loads of it, so Musgrave and Raynal set off for the island with an English seaman named George, a Norwegian seaman who went by Alec, and a cook from the Portuguese Azores named Henry. The trip was meant to be a reconnaissance trip. They wanted to survey the island to see if the tin was indeed there, and if it was, they could outfit the ship for a larger second expedition. Now, the trip to the Campbell Islands was fraught with a bit of dangerous weather, and Raynal fell ill, but overall it was fine. They didn't find any tin, though, so the trip was becoming a bit of a waste. In a last-ditch attempt to salvage the wasted mission, they decided to swing around to the Auckland Islands on the way back home. I mean, it was kind of on the way back anyway, so it made sense. Now, the Auckland Islands, as I just explained, were home to sea lions. Their pelts would fetch a decent price, and even if they could only get a couple of them, it would still be better than returning home with nothing. So Captain Musgrave approached the southeast corner of the Auckland Islands and decided to venture into something called Carnley Harbour, which was not actually a harbour, but a strait, a narrow waterway that separates the 2 main chunks of the Auckland Islands. Now, inside Carnley Strait, he saw sea lions and decided to camp out for a few days while collecting them. But as he sailed in, the wind picked up. Fearing the Grafton would be beached, Musgrave decided to sail further into the strait looking for a safe place to anchor. Quick word about his anchors, because it's relevant. To be blunt, they were crap. His ship had 2 anchors, but he skimped out on the chain a little bit. So to find a decent place to anchor the Grafton, Musgrave had to take the ship about 10 to 12 miles into the strait to find shallow enough land, or rather a shallow enough place underwater to drop anchor. And he ended up finding a small inlet pointing north into Auckland Island, where he anchored up right in time before the storm rolled in. But on January 2nd, 1864, the starboard anchor chain snapped. Starboard, by the way, is the right side of the ship when you're looking towards the front, called the bow. The left side is port. Port and starboard, left and right. So the other anchor chain, not enough to keep the Grafton still, started to drag as the storm whipped up the waters around them. Now the Grafton was creeping dangerously close to the rocks, but unfortunately for the men, there was little they could do to stop the inevitable. At midnight, January 3rd, 1864, the Grafton smashed into the reefs deep in the Carnley Strait. The Grafton didn't sink, though. It was all smashed up on the reef, but not completely gone. The men used the boat's launch, which is the smaller boat meant for quicker ferrying trips to and from the Grafton, to get clear of the wreck. Without getting too heavy into the details, they managed to salvage enough gear to set up a makeshift camp on the nearby beach. And they also recovered 6 pounds of tobacco, a few pieces of salt meat, 12 pounds of sugar, 2 pounds of tea, 3 pounds of coffee, 50 pounds of flour, and about 100 pounds of ship's bread, which would last 3 weeks if rationed properly amongst the men. Now, I know ship's bread as hardtack. It's barely bread, really. It's more of like a dense cracker thing made from flour and water mixed together, and if you're lucky, somebody will add salt in there too. Hardtack can last a long time, you see, so it's good for long voyages without refrigeration and stuff. They didn't have refrigeration in the 19th century. It's also a pretty cheap thing to put together. It may not be the most nutritious thing in the world, but it'll fill your stomach. It'll get the job done. So if you've been listening to any of my previous podcasts, particularly the one on the ghost ship or the Lost Franklin expedition, then you may also be wondering about scurvy at this point. How did the men on board the Grafton prevent that? Well, after the wreck, they'd have to scrounge around for some fresh foods, but they did initially leave with things like potatoes and peas and beans, things that had enough vitamin C to help prevent scurvy. Oh, here's a fun little tangent. So I was digging into whether or not they brought lime juice on board, like John Franklin did on the Doomed Terror and Erebus expedition, and the research wasn't clear, so that's not my tangent. But a few years after the events of today's story, the Merchant Shipping Act of 1867 required all Royal Navy and Merchant Navy ships to carry lime juice on board, a daily ration of 1 pound to help prevent scurvy. So that's pretty cool. At least they recognized that fresh fruits and veggies would prevent scurvy, and they knew that lime juice was cheap enough thing to bring in bulk. And it's certainly better than those lead-tainted cans that poisoned the poor men of Terror and Erebus. But anyway, back to our story. The men of the Grafton had it pretty rough, but they were determined to get back home alive. So after a few days of camping out on the beach, lamenting their situation, they rallied round and decided to build a proper, weatherproof cabin. There was a hill not far from the beach in the wreck, which would be a perfect place. It was 40 feet above sea level, so no need to worry about flooding. There were also sea lions hanging about, so for the time being, there would be access to food. Now, after pinching more supplies and materials from their wrecked ship, they got to work. One thing they had to contend with was the local flora. The trees on the Aucklands were not suitable for building, like American-style log cabins, which was their first idea. The wood was too gnarled and twisted, they couldn't lay it one on top of another to build a log cabin. So instead, they settled on using whatever wood they could harvest in a more vertical arrangement, lining them, top to bottom instead of left to right. Now, after a lot of hard work, they ended up making a 24 by 16 foot rectangular cabin. They used broken masts as corner posts, they put in cross beams to help make it more stable, and they even installed a fireplace and a chimney using sheets of copper that they salvaged from the wreck. All told, it was a pretty impressive construction for a bunch of castaways on an overgrown island in the middle of nowhere. The brains behind most of this, by the way, was Raynal. He was sickly, but he was smart. And though he was a gold surveyor by trade, he was also clearly a skilled inventor who would draw up plans and create some really impressive devices and structures. I'd go as far to say that without Raynal, they probably would have died. I mean, he really was the brains behind this whole operation, and he invented tons of things that allowed them to survive, frankly. And without his knowledge of the way things worked and how to build things, again, they probably all would have died. Now, Musgrave, the captain, became the group's natural leader. The men worked equally as hard because to survive, they'd all have to work together. Now, was it always sunshine and rainbows between them? No, of course not. Musgrave wanted to maintain some modicum of social order, because as captain, he was above his inferiors, at least he was on the ship, right? Now, we saw this play out a handful of times. For example, once the cabin was built, he and Raynal were at one end, while the seaman and the cook were at the other, like a physical separation of the men, just like it would have been on board the ship. It caused tension. The men felt like they should be equal with their captain, given the circumstances, but Musgrave was reticent to give up the social hierarchies that governed his life in the Navy. But despite some minor squabbles, the men banded together remarkably well. To entertain one another, they set up a school. Each man would teach, but each man would also be a student. Raynal, a Frenchie, would teach his language, French obviously, and mathematics to the others. Alec and Henry were illiterate, unfortunately, so they started to learn reading and writing in this makeshift school. And in exchange, they taught the others how to speak their languages. Alec taught Norwegian, Henry taught Portuguese. They even named their new little cabin house. It was called Epigwait, a North American indigenous term meaning near the great waters, or even a home by the wave. I'm not sure which particular tribe or nation the term comes from. It was never really made clear, and I couldn't find it in my research. Now, to keep from going completely insane, they stuck to a routine. They got up at 6 a.m. every morning to collect firewood and maintain the fire. Around cold, windy, wet Auckland Islands, having a fire is really, really important. On some days, they'd work on the house. They had to get thatching up on the sides to help insulate the cabin and to keep the wind out. But on other days, they'd spend the time hunting sea lions or whatever else they could get their hands on to replenish their stocks of food. They also found a big plant known as Stilbocarpa. The whole thing is edible, but they found that the stem was a sweet, starchy, edible thing that the men ate in massive quantities. In fact, I'd say without it, they probably would have died. Rhinal continued to make things, like soap for instance, out of sea lion blubber, to improve their quality of life. It was becoming increasingly clear that they'd have to spend the winter here in their new epic weight settlement, and they kept busy and worked together for their mutual survival. Most of you listening to this podcast live in the northern hemisphere, so don't forget, southern hemisphere winter is from June to August, and they landed in the beginning of the year. So as the months went by, the men were gearing up for a cold winter on this remote island, far from civilization, in the South Pacific. And unbeknownst to the men holed up at epic weight, another ship was about to crash on the other side of the Aucklands. The Invercauld, a square rigger, left Melbourne, Australia on May 3, 1864. It was heading east to Callao in Peru in South America. Now, unlike the little schooner Grafton, the Invercauld was much larger and had a crew of 25 men, but no passengers. Its mission was to pick up fertilizer. By this point in history, Peru was an independent country that made its money with silver mines high up in the Andes Mountains and with guano, which made an excellent fertilizer. Guano, by the way, is essentially bird and or bat poop. I mentioned it briefly in the episode on the London cholera epidemic as a cheaper alternative to, human waste fertilizer. At any rate, Peruvian guano made its way across the world, and the Invercauld was heading there to pick some up. The captain of the Invercauld, George Delgarno, estimated they were relatively close to the Aucklands on May 11, 1864. They were using a technique called dead reckoning to estimate their location. Dead reckoning is an old maritime way of determining your new position based on a series of factors. First, you need to know your initial position. Let's call it point A. From here, you need to know your speed and direction. So let's say you're at point A, heading south at 6 knots. I'll explain what knots are a bit later. If you're continuing south at exactly 6 knots, then you should be able to determine the new position, point B, because you know where you started, you know your speed, and you know your direction. All very important things for navigating. Let me phrase it in a different way that doesn't involve sailing. So let's say you're walking around your town. You start at your house, and you head directly east down the road, and you know that you walk at exactly 3 miles per hour. Given a map, you should be able to plot where you'd be after 1 hour of travel, right? Exactly 3 miles east of where you started, because you walk 3 miles an hour. And I'm sorry in advance for giving you a word problem there. Only masochists actually like math word problems. My bad. Simply put, dead reckoning was a way for navigators to estimate their future position based on knowing where they started, how fast they were moving, and what direction they were moving in. Nowadays, we don't need this though, right? We have GPS tracking. Your phone is a GPS receiver. It uses satellites to pinpoint your exact location at all times. So when you open up Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever, it tells you where you are and you can track your movement in real time, assuming you have signal. But out on the ocean, in the middle of nowhere, in the 19th century, they didn't have that luxury. They did have maps, compasses, clocks, and an astrolabe to help them chart their position, but those are all subject to human error, and the maps of the Aucklands were kind of garbage anyway, since only a handful of people had been there. Now, this is very unfortunate for the Invercauld, because human error with dead reckoning is exactly what led to their shipwreck. They did not properly estimate how far away from the Aucklands they were. They knew they were close, but they made moves assuming the wrong starting position of where they were. They were 20 miles away from their point A, so to speak, their initial position. So when they made their calculations, they were completely off. So they ended up sailing way too close to the northwestern cape of Auckland Island, which is a really dangerous stretch of coastline. So rough, in fact, it's named the Jaws of Hell. Captain Delgarno and his crew got stuck in the surf and fought for about 2 hours against it before their boat just gave in. The keel, which is a flat blade usually running down the middle of the underside of a ship, broke. The keel, in essence, weighs the boat down so it can't be blown completely sideways in windy or rough weather. It's got other functions too, but I'm just trying to keep this simple. A ship needs a keel, that's all you need to know. And the Invercauld's keel caved in and sank, broken. The Invercauld is toast at this point, there's no coming back from that. The masts and the rigging were also all broken up and sank. The ballast, which is extra weight added to help keep the ship stable when there's no cargo, also sank. Now, at this point in the 19th century, ballast is solid materials, like iron or rock or sand, things that are heavy and can weigh the boat down. Nowadays, we can use water, kept in special compartments, and we can add the amount of water or drain it as needed to help maintain that balance. But the Invercauld doesn't have that. It's all solid ballast, and it all sinks. So the ship was basically completely destroyed. It's gone, forget about it, and it sinks not too much longer afterwards. Of the 25 crew members, only 19 survived the wreck. 10 seamen, the captain, 2 officers, the cook, the steward, the bosun, the carpenter, and 2 ship's boys. You may not have heard the term bosun before. A bosun is a warrant or a petty officer responsible for taking care of the ship's rigging, anchors, sails, launch boats, flags, other things like that. And even though it's pronounced bosun, by the way, it is spelled, ready for this, Boatswain. So phonetically, it looks like boatswain. It's just another English word that isn't pronounced the way it should be, which is a bit silly to be honest. As far as I'm aware, bosun is a bastardization of the Middle English word for it, and that's just become the accepted pronunciation of the word now. Bosun. Anyways, this new crew washes up on what is essentially an empty, desolate beach. The back of the beach was a 300-foot tall cliff with a really lovely waterfall, but the water that pooled at the bottom was brackish, not fresh, because it mixed with the seawater on the beach. Brackish means slightly salty. The only visible part of the wreck at this point was the stern, which is the back of the ship, but soon enough that sank too. And unlike with the Grafton, there were far fewer resources found floating afterwards. The only food they could recover for 19 survivors were 2 pounds of soggy biscuits, 2 pounds of salt pork, 2 boxes of matches. But it's worth noting that the chef managed to burn an entire box of matches up, like almost immediately, so the other box was snatched up by someone more competent. Also, unlike the Grafton, and this part is really crucial here, Captain Delgarno of the Invercauld did not step up as a leader. Quite the opposite, in fact. He was so shocked from the incident that he was more or less paralyzed and just sat there despondently on the beach, waiting to die. The man who did the most to ensure everyone's survival was a seaman named Robert Holding. Now, this group sat on that desolate little beach at the bottom of a 300-foot cliff for 5 days. They ate through all of their supplies, and in that time, they had only managed to build a tiny little 5x8 lean-to. 5x8. 19 guys in a 5x8 open-air shelter on a beach with no food and no proper leader. Sounds like a winning recipe, eh? There were also no sea lions on this little stretch of beach, so the only food they could scavenge were little shellfish clinging to rocks. They also discovered the sweet starchiness of the stoba carpet plant, the same one that the Grafton survivors were eating in copious amounts, but that's not enough to sustain a man. Now on the 6th day, they started to realize that they would all starve to death on that beach. Shocker. So they started to make plans to climb up the cliff and escape it. Several went, but one kind of fell halfway off the cliff and knocked himself unconscious on the rocks. He ended up dying a couple of days later. But the ones who did make it came back to report on the top of the cliffs were tussocks and animal tracks, so signs of life. A tussock is a big clumping grass, like a big grassy pom-pom. So in this context, the sailors saw grasslands atop the cliff peppered with these massive clumps of grass. Look it up, I'm sure you've seen them before. Now, upon hearing the good news, Holding went up to investigate himself. He was able to determine that the tracks belonged to pigs, which were likely descendants of the ones released by Ross when he stopped over here in 1840, 24 years prior. Now, Holding, like Raynal, was also a gold prospector by trade, which means that he was an explorer used to analyzing geography for mineral deposits. So he took a good look at the land from up here on top of the cliff and determined that the mountainous areas to the south looked too inhospitable, so they should all head to the northern slopes and camp out waiting for rescue. And that's a shame, really, because had they head south, Holding and the Invercauld survivors might have run into Musgrave, Rynal, and the Grafton crew, who were doing a pretty good job of surviving, to be honest. But actually, who knows? Part of the reason the Grafton crew survived for so long in the Aucklands was that they worked so well together. They had a clear leader, they balanced each other out, and they supported one another. The Invercauld crew? Not so much. When one would find shellfish back on that little beach, they would eat it greedily instead of stockpiling and sharing with the whole group. These are not the actions of a group with a clear leader working together for the mutual benefit of the whole. These are the actions of individuals who will die because they refuse to pool resources. So Holding comes back, and he gets the rest to scale the cliffs, except that one who fell, who was left behind and died like the next day. But again, Captain Delgarno here is not being a leader, so as a result, the men start fracturing off into small groups. Holding tried to organize everyone to follow him to the north where he thought they could be rescued, but two things prevented that from happening. One, he was a seaman, not a higher rank, so the men didn't feel the need to listen to him, despite the survival circumstances. Two, again, the group was in total shambles, without a proper leader. It was like an adult version of Lord of the Flies with this group. Total, unorganized chaos that ended in a lot of death. And there were even pigs, too, so it is kind of like Lord of the Flies. So a handful of hunters, along with the cook, went out in search of said pigs. But the cook, tired, wet, and cold, just kind of sat down amongst the tussocks and refused to come back with the hunters, which was a bad move because the cook died overnight of exposure. The average temperatures at night in the Aucklands in May, the beginning of winter, can drop below freezing, and consider that they're not properly dressed for this, and it rains like all of the time. And most of them also didn't have shoes, by the way. They kicked them off in the wreck so they wouldn't sink when they swam to shore. So sleeping alone, barefoot, soaked and cold, on an exposed, windy grassland, no wonder he died. This is why shelter, by the way, is really important for survival. The first things you need to do if you find yourself in a survival situation is build shelter and find water. Most important things. Anyways, we're now down to 17 men. To make things worse, the two officers that accompanied the captain on board the ship refused to do anything. They were totally useless. And instead, they would force the young ship's boys to run around and do things for them, like fill up their boots with water so they could drink. And by ship's boys, I do literally mean boys. Ship's boys could range in age from 8 to 16. Now, back with the Grafton, there were some occasional spats that occurred because of Captain Musgrave's attempted adherence to social order and rank. But over time, though he was still undoubtedly the leader, Musgrave realized they all had to be more or less equals to get out of this situation. Like, in particular, the Norwegian seaman Alec was the strongest of the bunch, the biggest and broadest, so his skills were needed in killing and hauling around huge sea lion carcasses for food. But with the Invercauld officers, they were just so used to being better than everyone else in rank that they didn't budge. They literally just sat there. And to be honest, their refusal to treat the group as equal in this survival situation is what led to a lot of the deaths. They were clinging onto their past life on board the ship, when in reality, they were all castaways, equally moments from death at any minute. And if that's not the time to rally together under a leader and work together for the common cause of, survival, then I don't know what is. Anywho, like I said, the Invercauld crew is fracturing. Annoyed, Holding lost his patience and decided to go back to the beach to see if any other things washed up on shore while they were messing around in the tussocks. The bosun went with him. So they climbed carefully down to the beach, but all they found was the body of that one guy who fell. Eventually, 4 other guys joined Holding and the bosun, and they camped out on the beach. And are you ready for this? And I swear I did not know this before I started my research. We have a Donner Party situation again. Holding, the bosun, and the 4 other men drew lots to decide who should die to feed the others. You might remember that the Donner Party, the snowshoe party at least within the Donner Party, did the same thing with strips of paper. And the Irishman, Patrick Dolan I think his name was, drew the short paper. And though they didn't go through with killing Dolan, he was chosen to feed the rest, right, as a sacrifice. They just waited until he died from hypothermia before making the decision to roast his flesh and eat him up. So Holding and these other dudes are talking about sacrificing one of them for food, just like with the Donner Party, but Holding remarks that he would never kill a man and eat him, right? He took the moral high ground. But as soon as he said that, I think he got the distinct impression that he was the one about to be killed and consumed because he disagreed with everybody else. The bosun kept kind of awkwardly coming up to him, trying to come with him, which gave Holding huge red flags. So Holding just ran away and scaled the cliff as quickly as possible to get away from the rest. And once he got to the top, he continued to run away across the grasslands. The bosun and the other 4 guys were never seen again, so we don't know what happened to them. I'd like to believe that they Donner partied, for sure. And later, in another unrelated situation, Holding notes that he saw one seaman named Harvey eating the dead remains of his fellow seaman Fritz. So that is the only confirmed story of cannibalism that took place here. Sorry, I apparently really can't seem to get away from cannibalism. It's totally unintentional. But that's all the cannibalism for this story, at least. So those of you with weak stomachs, we're done with that now. So let's talk about how they eventually make it off the island. I won't go into great detail about all this because, frankly, we just don't have the time. But if you are interested in reading about this in more depth, I highly recommend you check out Joan Druett's Island of the Lost. She just gets right into the story in a really accessible way, and it's a great read. I really appreciate historians that make things accessible to the common audience. That's exactly what I try to do with the AF Out podcast. I've linked to her book in the podcast description. You should totally check it out if you like naval stories. Now, as I've hopefully made clear by this point, there was a clear difference in how each crew responded to the crisis of wrecking their ships. The captain and the crew of the Grafton banded together and made it work, right? They had camaraderie, they used their skills, and luckily were handy and inventive enough to eke out a tolerable existence while they either waited for rescue or decided to rescue themselves. But the captain of the Invercauld never stepped up, and as a result, there was no camaraderie, no sharing of ideas, no inventiveness, no collectiveness, just some individuals trying to survive, some putting in more effort than others, and as a result, all but 3 men of the Invercauld crew died. The only survivors were Holding, the captain, and one of the officers. Now, Druett, in her book, argues that perhaps the reason why it was the captain and officer that survived alongside Holding was that since they did so little for themselves and their own survival, they weren't exhausted and dying of hunger. It's certainly feasible. But one by one, members of the Invercauld castaways started dying of hunger. They could only get their hands on nominal amounts of sea lions, shellfish, and the occasional small rodent. Now, on the north end of the island, where the Invercauld crew are, was also Hardwick. You know, that settlement that failed after 3 years. After convincing everyone to head north to a beach to wait for rescue, Holding and the rest saw the remains of Hardwick. But it wasn't really good news because the place had been abandoned over a decade ago, so it was basically just ruins by this point. But it still made a better refuge than the open air of the tussock grassland, so they camped out here for a while and did find some tools that were helpful. Meanwhile, in the south, the Grafton crew are awaiting the summer weather again in hopes that they can see and flag down some whalers, or perhaps other ships looking for sea lions. But unfortunately for them, no rescue came. By October, I think Musgrave knew it wasn't going to happen, so he focused the Grafton crew's energy on planting a garden for another year of potential survival. And they also started making plans to fix their schooner, or if that wouldn't work, build a little boat out of the wreckage to sail north to New Zealand. So back to the last 3 survivors of the Invercauld in the north. They decided to build a rudimentary raft and head for a tiny island that they spotted off the shore called Rabbit Island, and you can guess why it's called Rabbit Island. They figured it was the best place to be spotted, and turns out it was a fine place to be rescued. On May 22, 1865, Captain Delgarno yelled to his officer and to Holding that he saw a ship. 12 months and 10 days for the Invercauld crew, they were finally rescued. The Spanish ship Julian, coming from China to Callao in Peru, sailed past the Aucklands, spotted them on Rabbit Island, sent out a launch boat to rescue them, and the 3 were saved. The Grafton crew, though, who had been there even longer, who had banded together and used straight-up human ingenuity to survive in this wild place, were not found by the Spanish ship. It didn't help that they were 12 miles up in the strait. They were basically in the middle of Auckland Island, right? I mean, who would find them all the way up there? So the Grafton crew focused their efforts on building a boat to sail to New Zealand for themselves, and after months and months of hard work, they managed to do it. 3 men, Captain Graves, Rynal, and Alec, they set sail for New Zealand, while George and Henry remained behind and awaited rescue. Musgraves and his little crew and boat traveled the 300 nautical miles separating the Aucklands with New Zealand. Nautical miles, by the way, are used to measure the distance traveled through water. A nautical mile is slightly longer than a land mile, coming in at 1.15 nautical miles per land mile. If you're wondering, why though, right? It has to do with the Earth's latitude and longitude coordinates. 1 nautical mile is 1 minute of latitude, and when you're sailing on the open ocean and all you have is latitude and longitude to figure out where you are, it makes more sense to use a measurement system based on coordinates. They traveled an average of 6 knots, by the way. A knot, which is another nautical measurement, is 1 nautical mile per hour. 1 knot, just like a nautical mile, is 1.15. So 1 knot is 1.15 miles per hour. So Musgraves and his crew in their little dinghy were going 6 knots, or 6 nautical miles an hour, which is 6.9 miles per hour on land. I know that sounds slow, but please consider they're sailing in a tiny little boat bobbing around in the South Pacific, right? Now I'm glazing over this part here, but the 3 men in their little boat did eventually make it safely to New Zealand about 6 days later, and the 2 left behind were picked up 7 or so weeks after that. The entire crew of the Graftons survived this ordeal. The Auckland Island shipwrecks of 1864 is an interesting story because it gives us a chance to compare how 2 different groups fared in a survival situation. Clearly, the winning group here was the Grafton crew, who banded together under a strong leader, was collaborative, relied on the fantastic knowledge and inventiveness of the Frenchy Rynal, treated each other somewhat equally, and ended up surviving together. Here are my takeaways from this. Work together in a survival situation. Don't go at it alone thinking you're better than everybody else because you'll probably die. Learn about the world around you and know how to do things instead of relying on the internet to give you answers. Without Rynal and his inventiveness and his knowledge of how things work, they would have died. Have backups and contingency plans in place in case something goes wrong. And as always, don't engage in cannibalism, because that rarely works out well for anyone. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Auckland Island shipwrecks. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. I referenced episode 10 a lot today, the Lost Franklin Expedition. Go give that one a listen if you haven't already. And if you'd like another naval tale, then give episode 5 a shout, The Ghost Ship. You can try to solve the mystery alongside me before I reveal what actually happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste. Be sure to follow my podcast wherever you listen so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.